Hi, I'm Chris Barraclough, and I'm going to talk about some growth opportunities in the telecoms industry. Essentially, I'm going to cover three things. I'm going to talk about the need for new metrics to support some of the new business models that we're starting to see develop in the telecoms industry, and then move on to talk about some of the other key requirements of operators and vendors and others within the ecosystem. And then finally look at a single player, Telefonica, and what it is doing to become an integrated Telco 2 player. Now, my colleagues and myself on numerous other occasions have talked about the Telco 2 platform, and more recently in our roadmap report we've run through the 6 individual opportunity areas within that platform. I'm not going to talk about them in detail today, but I am going to talk about some of the metrics and how they differ from opportunity area to opportunity area. Now, I think what it's worth understanding initially is the nature of the operational and financial model that operators are currently conforming to. It is a highly capital-intensive business, as everybody who works in the industry knows. And what I'm trying to show in this chart is rather complex. So if you're not financially minded, don't worry. Essentially, red is bad and green is good. We're in an industry where we are investing very large quantities of capital initially. And as a result of that, we generate sales on that's roughly, in any given year, about 50% of the total invested capital. Now, what operators are able to do, and this is a key metric at the moment of the financial community and managers within operators, is maintain relatively healthy EBITDA margins. So that is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization in the region of 40+% usually. Now, the reason why operators don't throw off more cash than they do is simply that a large proportion of that EBITDA needs to be reinvested in operating equipment, in networks and so on, so that the cash gets reinvested and the free cash thrown off is typically between 5, 8, 9% of total invested capital. So the cash return on invested capital around sort of 5, 6%. Now, what's different about other industries, and take Amazon, for example, which is the other extreme, is a business that generates very, very low EBITDA margins by comparison to telecoms operators. But it generates, on its invested capital, very, very, very high sales. And what we're talking about with these new business models, things like embedded communications, third-party business enablers, own brand OTT services, is that operators are required to invest relatively small volumes of incremental invested capital. So to build out an embedded communications business, things like data or connectivity included or bundled in with consumer devices like the Amazon Kindle, it requires limited incremental capital because it's already been invested in the network. Now, although the margins may be substantially lower in this instance for embedded communications, we've assumed that rather than getting the 45% they might get on their core services, operators only get 28%. Their actual free cash flow is very, very healthy because they don't require large quantities of invested capital. And what we hear time and time again within operators from managers is that projects get canned, postponed, set aside simply because the EBITDA margins are not deemed to be sufficiently high. Well, the reality is that they are living in a world where it's going to be very, very difficult to create the same EBITDA margins they're experiencing on their core business. And what they will need to be looking for is lower margin, incremental business opportunities that require far less capital investment. And we think that's a key requirement, the need for new metrics at the operational and amongst the financial community. And we asked recently in our London brainstorm, what delegates thought of the opportunity for the new business models to actually move the needle overall for operators. And we broke them down into embedded comms, third-party business enablers, and own brand OTT. And we gave them specific examples, so connectivity bundled with devices or with apps and services. And what was interesting is, unsurprisingly, each individual opportunity area was not deemed to generate either material cash return on invested capital for the overall business, or indeed a material reduction in cash return on invested capital. But what they did do, particularly for third-party business enablers and embedded comms, is that they were deemed to be, in individual terms, actually create a marginal or a moderate benefit to the business. And overall, our analysis suggests that that third-party business enablers and embedded comms can actually significantly move the needle. Delegates were more reluctant or hesitant or sceptical about the ability of own brand OTT to move the needle, and many felt that particularly around consumer apps and content, it was unlikely that operators would actually get a return at all. It would actually be a negative impact. So that leads us to ask, what are the four things, or what are the things that operators really need to do to realise these opportunities? And we think that break down to four areas. The first is investment. Currently, operators invest less than 1% in services. Now, that was fine while voice and messaging was integrated with the network. The voice and messaging revenues came as part of operating that network. As we've seen the delayering, and services and applications have actually started to exist and be created in the internet, that ability to generate revenues from voice and messaging services, particularly in the consumer marketplace, is coming under pressure. And we're not suggesting that operators need to invest a similar amount to network equipment providers, around 15%, or even consumer electronics and handset, which again is a similar level. But Google invests certainly 10-12% in services, and operators need to be increasing their investment if they are going to innovate. The second area, as I mentioned, we've seen the delayering and applications starting to exist separate from the network, both on the consumer side with all these apps that exist in the app stores and operate over the internet, independent of the network, but also with cloud apps and web apps on the enterprise side. Operators actually need to be much better in terms of their software skills and integrating telephony up into that environment. The other skill they need, and we've mentioned this on numerous occasions, is the ability to actually derive value from their customer data, both in terms of delivering their own services, but also in terms of helping third parties more effectively target and deliver a better consumer experience to their customers. The third area that we think is absolutely critical is scale. And any two-sided or platform player requires scale. Google's a good example with search. Microsoft is a good example on the desktop with its Windows platform. The issue that operators have is that collectively they have fantastic scale. The mobile networks and the fixed networks interoperate and work globally. But individually they have limited reach. And the players that exist in the ecosystem around them have experienced in the last few years substantial consolidation. So in the device side, we've got a few players, Apple, HTC and so on, starting to dominate. On the content side, again, Google, Apple starting to be very important. The network equipment vendors have consolidated rapidly and are down to 3 or 4 major players. Systems integrators, the IBMs of the world, again, large players. And even the ISVs, Microsoft and Oracle, dominate the lot, and then we have a long tail that sits behind them. And the reality is that these players have very good reach, not only downstream, with the downstream consumers and enterprises, but also upstream with other service providers. And what we think that means is that no longer is it that operators are simply going to buy services from these players and sell them on to their customers. But instead, we're going to move to a situation where these players are sometimes they are selling to operators, they have done in the past. Sometimes they're selling with operators, hand in hand with them. Sometimes they'll use operators as a channel to sell through. And indeed, in this sort of co-opetition environment, we're going to see selling against operators as well. It's a much, much more complex ecosystem. And no more is that seen in terms of co-opetition strategy. The fourth point I'm making is amongst the kind of new disruptors that we're seeing on the marketplace: the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons, the Facebooks. These players are both clearly friends of operators. They have, led to a large number of data plans being sold. They provided good pull-through for that. Facebook is a key example of that. People spend about 20 times as much time on Facebook as they do on their operator portal. But at the same time, these players are looking to compete not only in the new revenues, in identity and authentication, in advertising, in payments, but also increasingly starting to compete in the operator's own backyard in voice and messaging. And therefore, this co-opetition strategy, where you partner, where you compete, where you block, where you hinder, is very, very important for operators to understand. So turning finally to Telefonica, it's a very good example. This is a slide from Telefonica's investor relations about 18 months ago, where they clearly set out, and it was music to our ears to see this, Telefonica as a platform between third parties on the one hand and end users on the other. So very much a Telco 2 sort of play. And what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years from Telefonica is a very, very interesting building of an integrated network of Telco 2 projects. So some of those have been organic, like O2 top-up surprises in the UK, a reward system which is given to prepaid customers whenever they come to top up on the platform. They're given a network prize, could be some minutes, could be some SMS. And more recently, they've started to open it up to third-party prizes, so you can win videos and content and so on. And it's become a hugely successful campaign, backed by heavy advertising. The ducks you see in the picture have been advertised on TV, billboards, and so on. Linked to that, another area in Latin America that Telefonica has pushed hard is around Terra, and that was an acquisition. It's a media portal, one of the biggest media portals in the world. I think it ranks about number 30 overall in terms of websites. And Terra is very much a free to end users. It's funded by advertising, so it's a classic third-party business enabler, as we'd call it. It's ad-funded, and they have ad-funded music, Sonora, and ad-funded media, Terra TV. It also provides pull-through clearly for their core services in terms of broadband, because the more people can use these services, the more likely they are to buy Telefonica broadband. Another third-party business enabler service that's been recently announced in the UK is O2 Wi-Fi. And again, this is a Wi-Fi network particularly in retail environments, where Telefonica will provide free Wi-Fi connectivity to its users, and they will be able to download rich media content free of charge. Often it'll be ad-funded. There'll be ad-funded sort of marketing approaches. But the additional benefit of this, over and above actually generating a revenue on its own, is the capacity-constrained O2 network in the UK, which we've heard a lot about with iPhone. They will also be able to offload some of that traffic onto the fixed Wi-Fi infrastructure. So there's going to be a cost benefit for the mobile network. In terms of other projects we've seen that are around generating third-party business enablers, well, Bluevia is their API program, and that is a process in which they share revenues that have been generated by voice and messaging APIs with the developer. So they're saying to the developer now, if you generate revenue for us in terms of voice minutes, in terms of SMS traffic, we will share a portion of that back with you. Similarly, O2 Media, which contains their More program, which is an opt-in service in which consumers agree to share their customer data, that has been integrated with O2 top-up surprises. So now the consumer, when they top up on O2, they can actually receive relevant services from Telefonica. It'll be targeted towards them. Other areas that that Telefonica have invested in, Jar Jar was an acquisition they made. We see that as very much a kind of own brand OTT service. It's a VoIP play, not dissimilar to Skype. But what's interesting about it is that when somebody uses Jar Jar, the VoIP service is transferred over the Telefonica network, and Telefonica generates revenue from them. And Jar Jar is now has a run rate of around 100 million, up from about 1 million 4 years ago. So it's starting to generate traffic for their core services. VoIP, typically seen as the enemy of operators, is now, with Telefonica's model, starting to generate real money for them. Similarly, they made an acquisition in Spain, Tuenti, which is a social networking site in Spain. It's actually bigger still than Facebook. Facebook is growing there, but Tuenti is a social networking site. And like most social networking sites, it's making money from advertising and sponsorship. But what's really interesting is that they currently have in beta a MVNO called 2, which is actually taking the directory, around 12 million people, I think, in Spain, and they're going to make that available as an MVNO for them and generate revenue for their core business. Now, this is clearly non-exhaustive. Our next stage of activity is going to be to actually model this and really try and understand where the benefits accrue to Telefonica, both in terms of revenue, and we have some of this as public information, some of it is less public, but also in terms of cost and so on, in terms of the ability of some of these Telco 2 projects to actually have a benefit on the core business. So with that, I'd like to stop there. Thank you very much. And please do look at some of our other websites, telco2.net and so on, Telco 2 Research, and look forward to speaking to you soon.